Every war has two stories. The one they told you, and the one they buried. The files are now open. In November 1950, 15,000 American Marines were surrounded, completely cut off, by 120,000 Chinese soldiers in temperatures of minus 35 degrees. Their commanding general said only one thing: "We're not retreating, we're attacking in a different direction." What happened over the next 17 days became the most brutal, most heroic, and most overlooked campaign in American military history. This is the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. To understand Chosin, you have to understand the mood. It was late 1950 and everyone believed the Korean War was already won. General Douglas MacArthur had pulled off a brilliant landing at Incheon. North Korea's army was shattered and running. United Nations forces were racing north toward the Yalu River, the border with China. MacArthur made a promise the troops never forgot. The boys would be home by Christmas. But one man wasn't celebrating. Major General Oliver P. Smith commanded the 1st Marine Division, and something about the orders felt wrong. He was being told to push his Marines deep into the frozen mountains around the Chosin Reservoir, spreading them thin along a single narrow road. Intelligence insisted the Chinese would never enter the war. Smith didn't believe it, so he did something quietly insubordinate. He slowed the advance. He concentrated his forces instead of scattering them, and he ordered supply dumps and an airstrip built at a village called Hagaru-ri, in the middle of nowhere. His superiors thought he was being overly cautious, even timid. They criticized him for dragging his feet. The geography was its own enemy. There was one road. One. It snaked through mountain passes thousands of feet high, past the reservoir, with sheer drops on one side and cliffs on the other. And the cold was beyond anything the men had trained for. Temperatures plunged to minus 35 degrees. The wind cut through layers of clothing like they weren't there. What none of them knew was that 120,000 Chinese soldiers were already in the mountains around them, watching, waiting. On the night of November 27, 1950, the trap closed. The Chinese 9th Army Group attacked all at once, across the entire perimeter, in the dark. The Marines heard them before they saw them, bugles echoing off the mountains, whistles shrieking, and then the sound that men would remember for the rest of their lives. Tens of thousands of soldiers screaming as they charged down the slopes through the snow. The fighting was hand-to-hand within minutes. The Marines were outnumbered, sometimes 8-1, 10-1, and the cold turned every small task into a battle of its own. Rifles froze solid. The oil in the actions thickened until the bolts wouldn't move. Marines learned to urinate on their weapons just to thaw the firing mechanisms long enough to fire. Morphine syrettes froze, so medics held them in their mouths to keep them liquid. Blood plasma froze before it could be given. The wounded who couldn't be moved died of exposure. The dead froze solid where they fell, stiff within minutes. High above the main road on a frozen hilltop called Toktong Pass sat Fox Company, about 240 Marines. They held the single piece of ground that kept the entire division's escape route open. If Fox Company broke, 2 Marine regiments to the north would be trapped forever, so they didn't break. For 5 days and 5 nights, surrounded, freezing, running low on ammunition, they held against wave after wave of Chinese assaults. By the end, most of them were dead or wounded, but the pass stayed open. The Marines were surrounded on every side. Every road was cut. Every hilltop was contested. And then General Smith said the words that would define the entire battle. "Retreat, hell! We're just attacking in a different direction." It wasn't a slogan, it was a plan. Smith refused to call it a retreat because a retreat meant abandoning your wounded, your equipment, your dead. Instead, the Marines would attack south, punching straight through the Chinese encirclement, fighting for every mile of that single frozen road toward the sea. The breakout began at Udamni. 2 Marine regiments had to fight their way back down the road they'd come up, except now every ridge above it was held by the enemy. They didn't just march. They cleared the high ground hill by hill, often at night, often in blizzards, dragging their wounded and their guns with them. Getting to the trapped men was its own nightmare. A relief column called Task Force Drysdale tried to push through to Hagaru-ri and was ambushed in a stretch of road the survivors named Hellfire Valley. Vehicles burned, men were killed or captured. Only part of the force got through. What saved them again and again was the sky. Marine Corsairs flew so close to friendly lines that pilots could see the faces of the men they were protecting. They dropped napalm within 50 yards of Marine foxholes, close enough to feel the heat, and at Hagaru-ri, the airstrip Smith had insisted on building became a lifeline. Engineers had scraped it out of frozen ground under fire. Now transport planes flew out 4,300 wounded men and flew in 537 fresh replacements, who walked off the planes straight into the fight. And here is what most people never hear. The Chinese were dying too. They had sprung a perfect trap, but they had outrun their own supplies. They had no winter clothing. Many wore thin canvas shoes in snow that killed exposed flesh in minutes. They had no resupply, little food, and no way to treat their wounded. Entire Chinese units froze to death in their ambush positions, waiting for an attack that the cold had already stopped. But the hardest part was still ahead. The Marines still had to fight their way 78 miles to the coast, through every Chinese division between them and the sea. The final march ran from Hagaru-ri down to the port of Hungnam, and the Chinese saved their cruelest obstacle for the end. At Funchalen Pass, the road crossed a deep gorge, a drop of 1,500 feet, on a single bridge. Chinese engineers blew it. Without that bridge, nothing on wheels or tracks could get out. No trucks, no tanks, no artillery. Thousands of men would be stranded. So the Air Force did something that had never been done in combat. They airdropped sections of a portable steel bridge by parachute, and Army engineers assembled it over the gorge under enemy fire. The column rolled across. That column stretched for miles. Marines and soldiers, British Royal Marine Commandos. And behind them, thousands of Korean civilians, refugees who knew what would happen if they were left behind, walking south through the snow alongside the men who were fighting. Every mile brought another ambush, another firefight, another night in killing cold, but the column kept moving. At Hungnam, the sea finally opened a door. In one of the largest evacuations in military history, the Navy lifted out more than 105,000 troops, around 91,000 Korean refugees, 17,500 vehicles, and 350,000 tons of cargo. They left nothing for the enemy. As the last ships pulled away from the docks, demolition teams detonated the entire port behind them. The harbor of Hungnam disappeared in a wall of fire. The numbers tell part of the story. Around 1,000 Americans were killed, 4,500 were wounded, and more than 7,000 were taken out of the fight by frostbite alone. Chinese losses are still debated, but estimates run from 40,000 to 80,000, a staggering number, and many of them killed not by bullets, but by the cold. Every Marine who fought at Chosin received the Presidential Unit Citation. The survivors gave themselves a name that stuck for the rest of their lives: the Chosin Few. They had been ordered into a trap surrounded by a force 8 times their size, in some of the worst conditions men have ever fought in. And they came out carrying their wounded, their dead, and their weapons, having gutted an entire Chinese army group in the process. They saved X-Corps. They held the line in Korea, and they wrote the defining chapter of the Marine Corps in the 20th century. They went in as soldiers, they came out as legends, and most of America never even heard their names. If this is your first time here, subscribe. We drop stories like this every week. The files are now open.